Okay, this is just a follow-up about what the Spirit of the Scarecrow is, and just touching base on a few other things in this supernatural file of the Scarecrow. So what's the main point?
The main point would be the separation, the dividing of self that was required for a person to be completely empty out, hollowed out, so Satan and Lucifer could yield the greatest return on investment in making the most dangerous aspects to hollow out souled human beings so that they could be houses for the principalities of darkness. Major archetypes were embodied in human beings that were born and had souls at some point, and through their sin managed to completely separate their physical aspects, each individual organ, their skin, and then their spirit overshadowed in a very specific, called serpent-based way, where they were devoured by a serpent spirit.
For a second?
Yeah.
Well, to me, the Spirit of the Scarecrow is personal too, because they started using it with a best friend of mine. And his friend, of course, gave away her organs, and it wasn't just a spiritual transaction, it was a physical transaction too. There was not really a mall, but a whole square where there was Illuminati doctors, dentists, orthodontists. They had a Sethian temple that orthodontists ran with serpent worship and other things. So the Wrecking Crew of 5 actually went to what we called Voldemort's mansion, which was across from the Cthulhu temple, and they had surgeries done. They literally gave away their organs, and they were replaced with 3D printed organs for them. They gave away their teeth, some of them, to get the shark spirit imbued, so that they could go and accost and bite children with the shark teeth and other things.
Yeah, in one specific instance, one of our teammates had sold themselves out and had these reptilian scales grafted onto them to become the character file of Mystique from the X-Men, so she could try and shapeshift, but it was a botched process that was nightmarish to hold.
And it was delusional because the skin grafts and the scales to try to make her look like a dragon were necrotic and really awful, but in her mind she thought she was beautiful. Because mermaids are necrotic.
Yeah, she saw herself as being like the likeness of the actress in the movie with the blue makeup and everything. That's the image she saw in her mind's eye, because they were living so deep in delusion and were accepting of these false narratives that Satan was providing them, that all of them looked absolutely ghastly and beyond horrific. The amount of body horror we witnessed in these labs was beyond description. But that actually pales into comparison to the actual spiritual horrors we witnessed when these people hollowed themselves out and were living in this very deep delusion.
Yeah, the one friend that they made a scarecrow out of, and then they tried to inadvertently make a scarecrow out of Sean by trying to cut off parts of his body.
Across time, by default.
Time.
So it wasn't a matter of... I'll elucidate on that a little bit, because they were trying to build the archetype in a male. It seemed to be... because I had already received so much fragmentation from the onset of my early life, losing my eyes, my ears, and stuff like that, that Satan tried to connect the nodes between those traumas in time. I never gave these things to the armies of darkness, and I never asked for anything in return, but it was by default my soul essence was acting as a scarecrow spirit that they were trying to program in a greater control over the others, the other teammates and stuff like that, because I was acting as a team leader in the point in time when they all sold themselves out. So
and this got put into a cartoon called The Garden Wall.
Over the Garden Wall is the fairy tale retelling of my life raising myself as a young boy. So both Wart and the little kid are me, because I was Sean and John, and raising myself through this process of facing the challenges presented by the principalities of darkness focusing in so greatly. And there's a lot of coded messages in that about the chronology of how we as a team experienced the losing of people and the building of the wrecking crew and stuff like that. And Satan, the important thing about that cartoon, if anybody had, known anything about it, was that the main crux of the thing is that there's this farmer who's actually keeping Satan's light alive for him without even realizing it, because he believes that the soul of his daughter is kept alive by the flame. So he believes a lie, and he keeps the flame alive without even realizing it. And what he ends up discovering is that the forces of darkness soul resides within that flame, and then he extinguishes it when he realizes it. That is, his daughter's soul has been passed on to a blue bird who's free, effectively, and it's the man in his grief who holds on to that. And this was a spiritual parable, actually, about my personal experiences with loss and grief, and the restoration of our team being brought together outside of the Scarecrow spirit, and the kinds of disillusion and dissolving and dismemberment, the fracturing of self was so extreme that all the pieces had to be yielded to Jesus. They had to be yielded to God. These actual infrastructures here in Springfield were so precisely timed, but the forces of darkness only see shadows on a wall, because life is but a walking shadow to them, and it was easy to manipulate them into spiritual traps to offset a lot of the damage that had been caused by the wrecking crew and Voldemort and all the other high sorcerers that were trying to impede our progress.
Yeah, the physical aspects of the Scarecrow was like a draining life essence, because I saw my best friend lose pieces of herself and then her mind at the end, because I would go to a gym with her, and she actually would blow dry her hair and take on the physical manifestations of the Spirit of the Scarecrow. So she would be in a stupor, like a blank mind state, and actually blow dry her hair till it was fried out, and then turn around with hollow eyes and actually look like the Scarecrow spirit with burnt hair. So we'd see in the spirit these types of spirits that took over people too.
And it's related to another fairy tale retelling of this horror was Coraline, the movie, with the witch with the button eyes and the frazzled hair, because that's actually how she looks.
It was my great-grandmother, Coraline.
Yeah. The name was specifically tied to that because your great-grandmother was responsible for the founding of the idea as a Reverend Mother.
And the Weaver Witches. And
the Weaver Witches and Spiderwick Chronicles specifically, yeah.
The Puma time jumpers, all sorts of them.
How I ended up getting so... Yeah, I'll hold it if you want me to.
Go ahead first.
The aspect of how I got so fragmented, literally, in my body, is like losing an arm, and then losing a foot, and then losing my eyes, and my tongue, and my jaw, and stuff like that. All these things were separated in different instances because I was attacking in my own flesh the Reverend Mothers alone in my rage. I expended all of my physical, which was very, very severe levels of physical dexterity and what's the word? My constitution was really, really powerful, and I could do things, but I wasn't reliant on obedience to God. And this war I called a holy war against the forces of darkness by taking out the Reverend Mothers. It wasn't for God specifically, and that's how I ended up getting so fractured physically. The actual mental fragmentation seemed to come later. I would give pieces of myself as like sacrifices to win a battle, specifically to take out as many forces one by one by one, and see that they could not replenish, but I was slowly diminishing, or quickly diminishing. in spirit and in heart and in mental faculties. And my body had to be completely rebuilt. And then I spent decades rebuilding myself, all for naught, because Jesus restored me in a literal blink of an eye.
Quick battles for you.
The actual taking down of these forces was a lot less complex than I had managed to make it for myself. I just had to rely on God's commands. The parable about Saul not destroying the enemy utterly is relevant to this, because I wasn't not destroying the enemy. I was destroying enemies that were not supposed to be destroyed without God's divine timing, because his plans are perfect. And had I yielded and surrendered to his commands and in obedience done those things, I would have found myself a lot more whole than what was necessary.
Well, we're at a place here that's also a lesson in discernment.
Yeah.
So we called this place the Plum Fairy Island, or Tinkerbell's Island. Now, looks are very deceiving in the spiritual realm, because this particular fairy, bloodthirsty demonic entity, actually hid her spirit behind this oasis as a white, necrotic, tall being, and then she would appear and here in this graveyard, luring kids into her wooded area by portraying herself as a cartoon-like beautiful little thing.
And she called herself Tinkerbell, and the Peter Pan character was effectively what she tried to make herself look like. And she's actually, her physical body, she's like a goblin fairy spirit from subterranean Russia. She was one of the Baba Yaga spirits that existed out there for a long time. Can we talk about those?
Poison fruit.
Yeah, that don't rot. That's a bad sign, because they've been here for years.
So they create these tangled messes.
They pervert areas very slowly at first.
Change the vortexes.
Because this area was very sacred at one point. The filth and defilement that here, effectively what it laid the groundwork for Lucifer's landing pad. So there was a lot of events here in this specific area that were related to perverting something sacred by the sacrificing of galactic primes, spirited children, children of God.
Prime stalking, hunting. So what is a prime?
A galactic prime is effectively a Holy Spirit blooded child that is created in a genetic lineage that God and Holy Spirit birthed into being on this planet to be his greatest weapons and tools when they are yielded to him perfectly. That's the other thing, was like I was very destructive to other primes when I was not yielding to him. The lesson of Achilles is relevant here. You can be a boon to the forces that you command, or you can be a detriment, depending on which way your anger is directed and how you surrender yourself to God.
So these are like holy golden eagles and the remnant that nobody can mess with at the end of time.
They are the
reserved remnant.
They are the resistance against the forms of evil. And
so they tried to stalk and take out about 400 of them in certain spots and trap them in other areas.
Thankfully, God rescued every single one of the 400, and in a building not too far from here. The primes were being collected in time, and the specific ways that the primes were manipulated, because we all had a high spiritual calling and therefore our discernment was great from birth, was it required tremendous amounts of subterfuge, and the amount of resources that the forces of darkness expended just trying to get the allowed permission to harm one prime was tremendous. But it was worth it to them, because one prime's death could be the flood pathway for countless demons, and the perverting of specifically relevant tactical positions in geography.
Because prime's blood can overtrump any blood and can close stargates and close portals.
And galactic primes' bloods can work back way and forwards through their ancestry to translate themselves into any specific point in time when it is yielded to God. It's a specific genetic capacity where you're not actually time jumping or time traveling, because it creates no discord. There are no ripples.
And they always have the advantage because the Kingdom of Darkness can only see in like a triangular, holographic, dim, narrow perspective, right?
Yes. I had researched specifically the difference between how the forces of darkness see creation versus how we see. And I researched it through the eyes of all the principalities of evil, because that was one of the things that I was gifted with being able to do as a galactic prime. And I formed a model I called long view versus full spectrum. Long view is how Satan sees the world, and all of his forces of darkness have a various frequency within that. That includes artificial intelligences. But galactic primes and angels, they see the full spectrum of God's creation and can move around it
Organically,
like the breathing of in the motions of Holy Spirit. It carries us like a gentle breeze through all of creation.
So what's a face dancer?
A face dancer, there's actually couple different things. That's part of like the Dune file. I call them face dancers because there's a specific genetic anomaly created by Satan to effectively be without the core essence, and therefore it could read and then shift a facsimile of a specific kind of person or model of being or a frequency of person. And you can tell with your spiritual eyes that these are, and now you can just feel them, because most primes are activated with at least the ability to feel like, oh, this feels off. Most face dancers were killed because that was something that I was tasked with tracking, but not doing.
So they use DNA to do trickery.
They would use, they would reflect, they were basically like hollow mirrors. They were mirror people that had a hive mind kind of intelligence, sourced from the void. And they ended up using AI because the spiritual stuff didn't get too far. Because it could always be offset, but they started to harm less the primes and face dance against the population, the world. And so they would mirror back DNA and model it back in a crude facsimile. In the spiritual way, they look like poor copies. And when the AI got perfected, they started to realize that they could make a more perfect physical representation or copy of somebody, but not the spirit. They could never do the spirit too well because they only had the mental models. And you could actually, this was a weapon of warfare that was really important, was that they always had an expectation of what a person was thinking, but not being able to discern why a person was thinking that specific thing. And we taught and were trained in the methods of fooling the face dancers so that they could kill themselves. They could wipe themselves out as a hive mind.
So what is the Crooked Men and Black Lightning?
The Crooked Men is actually a really interesting and relevant thing because it's so complex. The forces of darkness for a long time realized that they could ride the blood and spirit matter of primes, and they tried various models of it to see various successes, but it was always driven by a sorcerer supreme, the actual entities, and a massive soul deposit and genetic deposit of all of the genetics and traumas of a specific sacrifice pool of genetic primes. And they would ride the consciousness, piggyback on it, and make like these long-legged, crooked men that were shadows and looked like dark vapor. And sometimes they could make them more physical, depending on the model of crooked men that they were trying to refine. They were trying to refine this for a long damn time, a really long time, thousands of years. It existed back in Atlantis, in all the civilizations that did child sacrifice. They were doing that specifically to harness and yield time-stalking spiritual bodies with physical power and exertion. That was completely parasitized off of a large pool, usually about 1,000 galactic primes all sacrificed at once.
And Cthulhu ties in with Tool and the Marine and principalities of the deep.
A lot of people don't realize that
And Nazis.
Cthulhu is a chaos principality that came from the void. I don't think we need to get too much on the origin of that, but how it's relevant to protecting yourself and fortifying your mind is that these chaos gods would attack the mind first with the frailties of the limited frequency of human perception. And the important thing here is chaos plasma, which is what the Nazi society was trying to yield when they were worshiping Cthulhu back in the ancient, and then at the turn of the century as well, in the ancient past and at the turn of the 20th century. They were trying to get more of this marine kingdom matter.
Is it like plasma?
It's blood. Effectively, it's blue blood. That's the reason that they call the elites blue bloods, because they are from the Atlantean kingdom of royalty.
So it's like squid ink.
It's basically like squid ink, and it's foul stuff that the Nazi shock troopers used to put onto their faces to go into furies.
A lot of things with tentacles and the octopus spirit seem to
And this
know
is
about
related to Hydra.
timelines too. Oh yeah, Hydra.
So yeah, it was all related to these chaos entities trying to form more connections through time, through blood. Blood being the pathway between their world and ours. So spilt blood, sacrificed blood, given blood is the necessary, it's a perversion of the holy concept of the blood is the life versus the life is the blood.
In pure sacrifice.
In pure sacrifice.
Defiled.
And so when Jesus died and his blood poured out of him, that was the pathway, quite literally, for the yeah, it's a very sticky path around here, but a lot's happened here, so it's necessary. But when he died and the blood poured out from his side, when the spear came through him, he knew that this was going to be the literal, we can take it at face value, pathway from which we are going to receive salvation, if we yield to it. The forces of darkness had already perverted this concept before his arrival as a man. That's why a new blood covenant had to be made, because the world was falling into ever greater chaos and darkness.
So Hydra is an intergalactic.
It's intergalactic.
being.
It exists within a prime evil principality space outside of known or quantifiable universe. So it's.
And its first stronghold was Kentwood Arms Hotel, that it actually became a living hotel and breathing extension of it, and its tentacles and its black matter and black goo.
So the black goo, when a person would yield their mind to Hydra, effectively what they were doing was that they were allowing their mind to be penetrated, and then when enough of the Marine Kingdom matter formed within their bloodstream, an actual physical octopus would be at the base cortex of their brain.
As an implant.
As an implant. And it's a physical entity. And it would be a hive mind. They needed a commander, which was one of the people that one of my best friends as a kid got possessed by this entity and was
Giving away secrets.
not only giving away secrets, but my genetics, which is ended up how I so fragmented and targeted. But the important thing to realize is that chaos needs a specific level of order. And we realize within these tests, these spiritual tests of the high spiritual warfare and physical warfare, we were doing real violent and very heinous combat against my best friend. And
It's a victim soccer ball right there.
yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of evidence in this specific place. But when that all got wrapped up, we ended up building, and he ended up getting saved and rescued and became part of the team again, is that we formed a model on how to properly anticipate the levels at which chaos needs a specific level of order. This is related to the yellow king and why the birth of the yellow king was essentially a chaos function where a person in chaos within themselves, a demon, was able to order the entire hierarchy of demons from the top or bottom up, if you want to look at it from the inverse end of it. But this area was all relegated to all of those principalities all at once. It's basically in the chronology we just described. So you subvert an area with a subterranean little fairy thing from the old world. You subvert that area physically with the blood, and then the principalities, would build upon that like the foundation stone. A perverse.
To defile an area, to break through gates, to destroy gates.
And after
We've even seen the earth crack open.
Yeah.
And breaches to hell in buildings and the earth.
We would see little hell gates open up and crack physical reality, and then the reality would warp around us.
Yes, and we've both been poisoned with strange fire, pure green swirly fire, and had fire. They actually experimented on me and tried to inject fire into my bones, strange fire into my bones.
They tried to do that. It's basically just the two of us because we were the only two who would survive it. They had been doing it to other crimes and they all died. They all disintegrated. So they found that we held enough coherence in our structure that we could hold. But eventually, when it happened,
They were painful, satanic, triple braided hooks though, but we did get healed and set free by the power of the real, true, living God.
The other kids were kind of shocked that we survived that specific version.
Yeah,
we basically tried to tell them that we literally were saved by God. And that was actually a moment of testimony that ended up helping a great deal of the other children.
Occam's razor, so to speak. We've also seen Sethian serpents, world serpent seeds, Leviathan seeds, a lot of serpent worship.
All of the serpent worship from the Kabbalists, the fake Jews, who were actual Nazis, they had stolen specific genetics from Hebrew crimes in the past, loved ones of mine and other tribes, and were wielding it in the present as fake Jews to destroy the trust that people have in Hebrewic community. And
real Hebraic roots.
The real Hebraic roots are, God says in the Bible they are the chosen people, so specific reasons. And that needs to be honored always. Hydra was at its core a hater of these chosen people because they represented God's covenant with the earth and the foundations of galactic time, genetics.
The power of Ham, the land, territory, and kingdom authority.
Because Israel is representative of what was happening here in Springfield as well. So
all these battles go back to Atlantis too, and the Rat King came from Atlantis.
All of those principalities focus here specifically. Because right here, this is Oz. Springfield is Oz. Quite literally, and figuratively, and mythologically. stuff that existed within that mythology are representative of what was actually happening here in the timeline, which is a major element of this logo that's highly trained. The golden brick road was devoted to the spirit, and they tried to subvert it. But to get back to the idea behind the Hebrews and the Kabbalists and the Sphinx that we were talking about, there's a massive serpent, a couple leviathan seeds, world serpent seeds out here, and the Kabbalists would attempt their best to resurrect every one at different times. So they had different ages, like one of the youngest ones is still larger than any of the buildings they experienced in. But they were doing so much sacrifice that they were eating the main serpent, and as it digested the spirit fragments, which is what it actually did, it would take a physical person and digest in them all of the spirit fragments, pass them out, and they would be fragments across time. And there was a giant pool of what used to be living water that became a portal for these fragments to manifest, and they could track there for a long time. Right across the street from where the Sethian temple and the Kabbalists would work to build Hollywood up using clones.
There's one in Menominee, Wisconsin, too.
All of the places we described where they were doing research to divide up the children and stuff like that in physical matter, they were using the spirit fragment from the pool behind the serpent that had digested them to occupy twin bodies, which they built and manifested right across the street, where this massive army of spiritual and physical things, there were millions, tens of millions of things swarming across the ground so quickly that you couldn't see the actual ground. Black snake chaos. And I called this the black snake moan.
Yeah.
Because as you were digesting this horrifying behavior that I had also gone through, the black snake would be moaning for a specific soul capacity to occupy, and would carry the spirit from the pool. It would carry the actual physical spirit into a clone body, and that person would be trapped in that form, in that vessel.
There was also snakes climbing down from trees that were black.
They were just, and like I said, it was physical, but the spiritual snakes would take the person's spirit and they'd lay down flat on it, and then they would find a specific frequency or vessel that they want that spirit fragment to be in. And this is one of the darkest, most ancient forms of Kabbalism that's existed since the beginning of time. And the artificial tree of life was a seed that was planted in us by being digested by this world serpent seed. And that was definitely related to cloning centers, which are now,
in the Obama administration, there was a lot of unnecessary things that happened too. The
intelligence community got their balls cut off, quite literally, and weren't able to do the appointments necessary to protect and be forces for good anymore, because there wasn't enough people that possessed strong character.
Yeah, so they launched a 500 clone attack army from the Frankenstein house.
Yeah.
And other things.
Yeah, that was related to something called the Horus heresy, and which was also birthed here in town. All of these things are chronologically the processes by which the primevals and principalities of darkness infiltrated Springfield for the maximum yield of destruction and chaos. And it was very, very successful for a point in time.
So the Horus Heresy was a clarion call that went out too early for the end times remnant to gather. And all the children gathered in one place, and then it turned into a nightmare because they were trapped there and couldn't leave. And then they had to deal with spirits of Ra and Hathor, and who else was there?
That was the element of the world serpent, the actual world serpent, the real one, coming up from from above and Cthulhu's tentacles from below.
Coming
and
up
creating
out
a
of
time
pools
maze.
in the backyard.
So they couldn't destroy us. They couldn't even fragment us. So they decided that the best course of action is to have our actual souls and our bodies cycle in a void space called the Eco Time Maze, ICO Time Maze. And it was one of the greatest spiritual, that's not relevant to talk about now, but basically what happened in the Time Maze became the life of the people who walked it. It became their waking life, because that's how it worked. And what ended up happening there was so godly, actually. The amount of mercy and intelligence that was gathered on how to best fight the enemies of darkness. And the tools developed there were so strong that it actually offset the Horus Heresy completely.
Yeah. These two hotels, the Green Stays, were connected by an underground elevator shaft and base. And they actually had huge tarantula-like spiders that they drop
all
people in the elevator down into and do all kinds of things. They're
all of the time-devouring entities, like the time tarantulas and the gator people and the serpents and the worms, they all existed
frogs.
there. Yeah, and anything that's from the work of the armies of darkness that can devour souls to fragment them in time. And that place was built to be a ghost house, to house the spirits of all the primes who were sacrificed down there in that pit, in that elevator.
We're going to continue in a nice warm vehicle.
Yeah, that seems like a good idea. We got a good layout of the land anyway.
Okay. Green Stay, Clarion Call, Horus Heresy. What was the real Assassin's Creed?
The real Assassin's Creed is based in my family and other Galactic Prime families. We could be translated through our own generations, our own ancestry. The forces of darkness tried to create something called the Animus, which is a holographic reconstruction of the same thing, but it didn't work. They didn't understand why they couldn't access genetic memory. And that's because, in Galactic Primes. They could do it in normal people, but they couldn't do it in, because reincarnation does not exist. Let's just get that out of the way. Reincarnation does not exist. A person, when they dies, they are translated in time based on the will of God. Either they go
Not everybody.
No, a person. I said depending on the will of...
If God wants to keep somebody in time here on Earth, he will definitely make sure that happens.
And I will attest to that being because I've died in my physical body many times. And he would translate me back because he's like, no, he's staying in this time. And I could not leave physically or spiritually, and I didn't want to anyway, from the assignment he had provided me. And there was no thing that could actually kill me or destroy me until the thing or appointment was reached. And that's the guarantee that God provides. So I will definitely attest that death is not real, and reincarnation is not either. But heaven and hell are very, very real concepts that need to be understood right now.
There's an eternal resting place for every soul.
And so the Assassin's Creed was Galactic Primes stemming from 3 branches of Prime genetics being able to translate themselves generationally, leapfrogging through each other, the literal passing of the totality of a person's soul and consciousness through the genetic lineage backwards and forwards in time. This genetic translation is a specific thing that's noted in the Bible.
Like a trefoil.
And this was a secret weapon that the enemy could never, ever get their hands on. The Dark Templars and a specific friend of mine, who's like a little sister to me, betrayed us many times and went to the forces of darkness. And the events that were in the actual film, and to a lesser extent the video games of Assassin's Creed, was actually what manifested. A member of my spirit family betrayed us and was trying to divine a method of doing the exact same thing that we were doing in spirit, that she had lost the ability to do, and give that to the forces of darkness so that they could have control over the world gates and greater territories. Because
one got really jealous that she wasn't called to do the things that, say, a super soldier kid could do, so then she just basically gave herself away. The dragon snake queen.
Yeah, she found it necessary to go to Blackthorn and really, really, really mess with my ability to be birthed into the world.
Which set up shop at the Thornberry Mansion / Voldemort's mansion.
Yeah, Voldemort's mansion was built by an ancient family that were the fake version. Quite literally, you know, I taught about face dancers before. These were face dancers who were going to be the fake version of my family. They were going to be the anti-version of my family, who held space and protected this territory.
Like falsely created genealogical branches.
Yep. They were
tried
artificial.
To graft into time to wreck the destiny of that family line.
Yeah. So they were called the Thornberries because they were called the Berries. Their last name was Berry when they first came here. There's a beautiful red robin. That's interesting. Tune. And they were specifically appointed by Satan to be. They had no real souls. They were created from a facsimile of function and archetype to infiltrate and build anti-structures to what we were doing here in town. And they were called the Berries. And then Satan wanted to give them the crown of thorns, and which is what rested atop Jesus' head while he was sacrificed. Satan had taken that and had been using it as a massive nuclear weapon for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And he gifted it to this family so that they could have all of the principalities of darkness at their beck and call to try and wreck my family and what we were doing here from before time was time, effectively. It was not yet a physical reality. Springfield was not yet a physical reality. And what that ended up becoming the Wrecking Crew, in fact, because the Thornberries were the ones who were responsible for creating the infrastructures to place all of our team against one another. They were the main branch of deceit and subterfuge and destruction for all future and past operations that we were doing to operate in God's call that he had given us. And this version of the Thornberries was very detrimental to a great many amount of children. I think it's relevant to say that Satan had placed with the Bushes under their command in relation to and by the instructions of the Thornberries to build a pregnancy center where they were taking prime mothers whose children were actually safe and convincing them that this nearly dead child that existed in the base, that he was their child that they were seeking. And the women were so filled with grief and despair that they accidentally agreed to provide their wombs to birth abominations. They were birthing new genetic lines from these genetic primes through rape and torture. But they would also spiritually steal the genetics and scatter them through time. And these prime mothers were very, very, very important to God. And what happened to this child was he ended up finding a way to communicate outside of this base where these women were being held. And there was a rescue that ended up happening where all of the genetic branches that were created from these agreements were canceled out almost within a year of the actual inception of this method of torture. And that's also related to, everything seems to be predicated upon the perversion of genetics, because a tribe, like we say the Hebrews, are called to be king and holder of space for Israel, because God has commanded it since the beginning.
Priests and priestesses.
So a specific family is called to be a ruler of a specific territory. And there's nothing that the forces of darkness can do once that thing has been established, except God finds further ways to refine the forces at his disposal.
They just choose to go into rebellion against it and assert power. Well, should we end off on just some Oklahoma experiences, like the abominations at the Mayo building and the Adams building, for one? What happened there? Because that was a hell breach there, too.
Yeah, a lot of hell breaches happened there because of a sacrifice of a few thousand primes. And the world serpent almost manifested itself through between two buildings. The Mayo is Mephistopheles and Azazel, Yeldaboath, and Ouroboros. And God forgive me if it wasn't necessary to speak the demonic names, offset.
But Mayo also connected to Minnesota and Rochester Nazi
and Wisconsin as well.
Yep.